we have a lot of eager reporters who want to ask you questions, but I wanted to say welcome. Thanks for making time. Since you need no introduction, I'm not going to waste your time with one. Let me turn it over to you, and then I think we have a group of reporters eager to pelt you with questions.
Great. Well, I won't speak too much so that we can get right to the questions. I'll just offer one reflection, which is I think that especially as we take stock of a really extraordinary year that we've had, we're really in the middle of what are simultaneously the best times and some of the toughest times for transportation in decades. Now, what I mean by that is we have the best of times because we're making historic investments across every mode of transportation, many of which had been sought and needed for my entire lifetime. And on the other hand, we have confronted the most serious, varied, and sustained set of disruptions to the transportation system, arguably since World War II. If you look at the way that we have seen impacts to everything from container shipping to airline cancellations to rail. Good news is the disruptions are from sources that are mainly temporary, mostly COVID. And the investments that we're making are permanent. They're going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So it makes this, I think, the most dynamic and exciting moment to have the portfolio that we have here at DOT certainly in my lifetime, I would argue in a very long time. And obviously gives us a lot to talk about. So let me wrap there on my preamble and get to your questions.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that. Well, let's turn to the meat first. We've got a question on rail from Kansas.
Hi, Secretary Buttigieg. I'm Daniel DeRocher. I'm the Washington correspondent with the Kansas City Star. We're working on a project about railroads, so I've got a bit of a long wind up here before I get to the question. But the chairman of the STB says America's Class 1 railroads are facing a long-term self-imposed crisis after years of worsening service and deep employment cuts. Federal law leaves communities across the country helpless to deal with the issue of longer and longer trains cutting off access to hospitals and first responders. People continue to die at unprotected railroad crossings that have been pegged for safety improvements, and railroads could pay for life-saving improvements, but instead wait until state and federal governments fund them. Do you believe that the federal government should do more to regulate the industry to ensure that it is meeting its common carrier obligations and protecting the welfare of its employees and the public?
So first of all, I share the overall viewpoint of the STB chair. And I think that one thing we're observing right now is the evolution of the business model in Class 1 rail toward one that really strips out the human element relentlessly as much as possible, is related not only to the labor issues that we've been experiencing that came to a head this fall and winter, but also some of the performance issues that the system has been experiencing in terms of fluidity, which is obviously a concern in terms of supply chain throughput. I think we do need to be very attentive and very hands-on with all of the tools in our toolkit to drive better results and a better experience in cargo rail. And that's true on everything from making sure that it's safe, which is, of course, our primary responsibility, to making sure that freight rail can be compatible with a high quality of life in communities that it passes through. A part of which we can address through investments we're making on things like railroad crossing elimination, sometimes even in partnership with the freight rail companies, but may also require management or regulation of their activities. And I would add to that compatibility with passenger rail operations. You know, one of their obligations is to prioritize passenger rail. STB is, I think, taking a more muscular stance, and rightly so. And FRA has new authorities to gather data and publish performance here toward making sure that the Class 1s meet their responsibilities there. So I do think you're going to continue to see a lot of focus here. We're only going to work within the authorities we actually have. We can't invent authorities just because we want certain things to happen, but we're definitely going to use the tools that are in our toolkit. They're somewhat different than STBs, and I'm excited to see STB doing their own work in this regard. But we're going to be vocal and continue to speak to what we think needs to happen in railroading for there to be better outcomes for everybody. And that I think can include good outcomes for shareholders. But what we can't go on with is shareholders versus the world in terms of who's benefiting from this business model.
From one hard question to the next, let me pivot to Sophia. Are you here? Sophia Kai of Axios, who had a question about the dealing with the new Congress.
Hi, Secretary. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to talk to you about, how you would handle requests to have you testify about, a number of federal programs that have passed under the Biden administration. A lot of companies who have, been concerned that they've taken money for infrastructure, other items. You have some lawmakers saying they'd like to give you a parking spot. How willing are you to sort of appear and comply from some of these, political and otherwise oversight questions?
Look, I've gone to the Hill a lot. I'm sure I'll continue to do so. We have a good story to tell, and I'm happy to tell it. I prefer to tell in context where the questions are coming in good faith, but we're also ready to be challenged and to defend our course of action in the face of those challenges and to adjust it anytime those challenges are actually right. We have a set of initiatives on infrastructure that are widely supported by the American people, that are the result of bipartisan work in Congress. One of the things I love about the transportation portfolio is it's one of the most bipartisan areas that remains in domestic policy. But where there is a contest over what's the right thing to do, and where people object to our efforts to reduce the impact of transportation on the climate, or where people have a problem with us trying to make sure that this round of infrastructure investment is equitable and treats people fairly across racial and economic and regional lines, I'm absolutely ready to take our case to the Hill, just as we do to the public. And I think we will have, continue to have support when we explain what we're doing and why.
Okay. I have a question. Is Jimena, I don't see Jimena here, but Jimena Bustillo of NPR asked a question. Let me ask it for her in case she can't make it. I know the railroad strike, of course, has been averted, but she was wondering why the Biden administration decided not to provide sick leave to the railroad workers, because it was such a big sticking point. And you mentioned, trying to ameliorate the labor problems. What's your view on that?
Well, the administration doesn't decide what to provide. This was a negotiation. When the negotiations broke down, labor unions asked the president to form a presidential emergency board. He did. The board came out with recommendations that were used as a framework. The negotiated tentative agreement went beyond what the PEB had come up with, and it reflected the priorities of what the different parties decided to negotiate. When that wasn't ratified by the unions, and the choice came down to allowing a shutdown to happen, or asking Congress to enact that tentative agreement reached by the parties, the president and our administration asked for Congress to make sure that tentative agreement could be enacted. That's what happened. Of course, we believe in paid leave for railroad workers and for all workers. We have repeatedly advanced legislative proposals that would make sure everybody from a railroad worker to a white collar worker to a fast food worker would have a high standard of paid leave. We continue to stand ready to work with anybody who would work with us on that, especially some of the members who in the Senate who seem to have reversed themselves on the Republican side and said that they're now for paid leave, at least in this context. They have a wonderful opportunity to put their money where their mouth is. Just go out on the floor, propose a bill, I think they'd get universal agreement from our side. So if they have changed their mind and dropped their opposition to paid leave for all American workers, fantastic. I think they'd find an administration willing to work with them on that. Otherwise, it's just politics.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else have a question out there? Raise your hand, raise your Zoom hand, or just interrupt.
Hi, Secretary, thanks for joining us. I'm a producer and reporter for ABC News. I cover Congress mostly, but I do have a question on behalf of my colleagues who cover the transportation beat. They were just wondering if you did have any update on the Keystone pipeline situation and the leak that was reported on Wednesday, and any more background on that to share. Thank you.
Yeah, so what I can tell you is that the FINRA, which regulates pipeline safety, has put in a corrective action order that includes a number of steps that the pipeline operators have to comply with. It's everything from a shutdown of the affected segment for as long as is necessary for safety reasons, to requiring a root cause analysis, which I should emphasize needs to be done by a third party. My colleagues can get you more detail on that. We've published the text of the corrective action order, but certainly something of great concern. It's not the first time that there has been a spill or a leak issue with this pipeline, and so it's one that we're monitoring very closely, and we'll be investigating and following up on.
Thanks.
Kirk, I think you're up.
Pleasure being here, Secretary. My question is about the administration's proposals to the presidential nominating calendar. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and if this nominating calendar was in place in 2020 when you were running, how would that change your strategy?
I can't really speak to that because it's on the partisan side, and I'm sitting in this office breathing taxpayer-funded air. What I'll say is that I respect the process. It doesn't bear much on my day job, but it'll be interesting to see it unfold.
We've seen all these attacks, the attacks on the North Carolina power station, the hurricanes, the wildfires in California, incredible disruptions to the grid. You mentioned the disruptions, but DOT has this decarbonization policy, which is great, but makes us more dependent on the grid. So what are your views about, resilience when we're moving to more and more electricity and we have the more and more vulnerable grid?
Well, look, I think every mode of moving energy is vulnerable in different ways and for different reasons, right? The most significant cyber attack that we've had on energy distribution in the U.S. In our tenure here wasn't on an electrical grid; it was on the Colonial Pipeline. Certainly, electrical grids are vulnerable too, whether we're talking about cyber attack or physical attack. But that's a pattern that's true across any of our physical infrastructure, whether we're talking about transit systems or increasingly driving, which will be increasingly automated. And so I think the real lesson is that we have to make sure that our critical infrastructure assets are harder targets for disruption, whether we're talking about cyber, physical, or other vectors of attack. It's challenging because most of our critical infrastructure, rightly, is in private and or local hands. There are 3,000 utilities in this country that all need to secure whatever piece of the electrical picture belongs to them. Most water treatment facilities in this country are municipal, and most of our supply chains and transportation systems are in private hands. So, and of course, we got to make sure our own side of the house is in order too when it comes to something that is in fact owned and operated by the federal government, which in terms of transportation, the main example would be the air traffic control system. So, specifically in terms of resilience and electricity, I think ultimately there is a greater opportunity for resilience when the fueling of cars, for example, doesn't require moving large quantities of liquid fuel around the country. And when you can have distributed generation, right? I mean, you can have a mix of on-site and utility scale generation of electricity in a way that's obviously not the case. You can have a rooftop solar panel on your garage. You can't have a rooftop diesel refinery. So I think ultimately this could lead to greater resilience, but it's definitely the case that we can't run tomorrow's vehicles on yesterday's grid. And that's why I think there's a lot of wisdom in the way that the Infrastructure Act was built that contemplates these things at the same time, upgrades to the grid, right alongside upgrades to the highway system and everything in between.
Hi, Secretary. I'm Victoria Knight. I'm a health policy reporter with Axios. So I want to try to ask a health policy question. I don't think people think about this, but transportation does have some health implications. I mean, if you don't have access, it can be harder to access healthcare, but also, if you take public transit, it reduces traffic and also air pollution. So I'm wondering, how do you, is that something you guys think about at the department? Are there health implications for policies? I'm just curious.
Yeah, totally. I mean, without getting out of my lane or out of my depth, there are clear connections between public health and transportation design and outcomes. One, to just take one example, I mean, one reason you see a lot of racial disparities in respiratory illnesses, like asthma incidents, has to do with where people live and the fact that, for example, Latino children are more likely to live proximate to highway interchanges and or port operations that have more particulate matter in the air. So if we are electrifying America's ports or investing in low and no emission buses, or establishing better access to public transit, and we're definitely doing all three of those things, one outcome of that should be a higher standard of public health generally, and a higher level, or I'd say a lower level of disparity in public health outcomes. I would say some of the starkest differences are in Indian country, and that's definitely connected to transportation, whether we're talking about emergency medicine or whether we're talking about access to routine care. On one hand, some tribes have independent revenue sources that they can use to provide clinical resources for their tribal citizens. On the other hand, it is astonishing from a transportation perspective that within the territory of the United States, there are as many people and as long distances on dirt roads as there are. And that you hear heartbreaking stories when you visit a number of tribes about people losing their lives or having worse outcomes because a washed out road made it impossible for an ambulance to get to where they needed to get to, or for a patient to get to a hospital. So, whether we're talking about emergency services or whether we're talking about environmental justice, there's a clear connection. And to the extent the statute allows, we're contemplating that in the way that we lay out our discretionary funds, and we're encouraging the state departments of transportation that run our formula funds to do the same, because the connection is very, very clear.
This is kind of bigger picture, Secretary. I'm just curious. You were a mayor, so you have had some experience with transportation policy, but just big picture, what is it like coming into a job where you're learning a lot of the subject matter, or you're dealing with things that you maybe haven't dealt with before? What is that process like? Just at the macro level of running an agency, a department that impacts so many Americans, and is it a constant process? Do you feel like you have a sort of a handle of how everything is connected in this country now, or is it sort of come up, follow the news cycle or the appropriation?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think must be daunting for any new cabinet secretary, and you definitely experience here, is the sheer scope of our operations. And no matter what your background, and I felt that my transportation background had a lot of richness to it, coming in as a mayor who dealt with a lot of these things at the scale of my city, is still only ever going to be a tiny slice of what goes on at a department like this. Not only is this the Department of Plane, Trains, and Automobiles, but it's came up before. We regulate pipeline safety. We license commercial space travel launches. We run a service academy for the U.S. Merchant Marine. I mean, just things that most people may not even know are in the scope of this department. Not to mention there's this sheer complexity of any given thing that everybody does know is in our scope, from what it takes to fund a bridge project to how we run the crash test dummy program. And so the most humbling part of it, especially if you're a curious person who enjoys digging in on issues, is recognizing that more often than not, substantive technical mastery is not how you're going to earn your paycheck as a secretary. Sometimes you need to master a complex issue, or at least learn it well in order to make good decisions or to do your job. I never thought I'd get as immersed as I did in the finer points of radio altimeter interactions with cell phone towers, for example. But if you recall the 5G issues that we've had that were looming large a year ago and are still with us, there was no way to play my role without getting immersed in the details of it. So what you wind up doing is learning to trust and empower teams of experts many of whom are career employees who've been here decades as secretaries have come and gone. And to engage outside stakeholders, everywhere from Congress to the academy. And to know when the issue at hand is a technical one that needs to be left to them to handle, or when the issue is fundamentally not technical. You may need technical insights to see it, but what's actually at stake is a question of values. That is the kind of question that political appointees are supposed to address in the name of an administration that believes these calls should go one way and not another. And of course, where you really earn your paycheck, sometimes it is operationally, just stopping bad things from happening. But often it's negotiating those moments when the things you care about come into conflict with each other. When your commitments around doing something quickly and doing something right, and doing right by the climate and doing right by workers, and supporting America's global economic competitiveness, safety, and a whole bunch of other things are jostling for priority. And those are the moments that really test you, require a lot of you, but are also sometimes the most rewarding in terms of this job. They remind you why we have people and not formulas making some of these decisions.
I would love to ask you about, this issue of turnover. It's not a political question, but we reported, even before the midterms, that Ron Klain had appointed Jeff Zients to head up this effort to, come up with some lists and pipelines for potential replacements at the senior level, at the most senior levels, at the level of the secretary, assistant secretary. I mean, is this something that you are concerned about in the Department of Transportation? And also looking horizontally, we've seen reporting of Secretary Yellen, Secretary Mayorkas, like potentially, moving on. But what has been sort of, how is that effort going? Like, what kinds of conversations are you having with your peers as well as with your department?
Yeah, so, after the midterms is a typical time to expect some churn. I'd say one thing that's been striking to be part of this administration is how stable the top team has been. And I think, I don't want to say this on the record because I could be wrong, but I think in terms of the cabinet and maybe in terms of senior White House staff, you might know this better than I do. Some records have even been set in this administration in terms of how little churn there has been. I imagine now is a time when you'll actually see some of that start to happen, if only because of the crushing demands of a lot of these jobs that my colleagues are doing. Thinking internally, it's, and it's always been my experience that great people, senior or otherwise, because they're great, often get opportunities to go do other things. And so you want to support them when they do. It creates challenges, but it also creates a chance to empower and promote people who've been doing well within your organization. And it creates a chance to bring people into your organization who you would love to work with, but are on the outside or somewhere else. So, I view this moment as an opportunity to support colleagues. I'm certainly glad to have this job and as demanding as it is, looking forward to continuing to do it. It's funny, actually, just earlier today, I was looking, I had not paused to read that we all have these certificates of, it's the thing that executes our appointment signed by the president and secretary of state. I don't know why I never really paid much attention to language. It's beautifully written. I think it's probably a formula that goes back to the founding. But the end of the paragraph actually says, it's et cetera, privileges and emoluments to the same of the right appertaining to him, said Peter Paul Montgomery Buttigieg, during the pleasure of the president of the United States for the time being. And I actually never noticed that the words as if at the pleasure of the president were not clear enough that for the time being is added in there. I think we're all aware of the contingent nature of our grasp on these roles, not just serving at the pleasure of the president, but because of the way the electoral cycle works. But I think it reflects really well on the president and on our chief of staff and on this White House, that the team has been so stable. And at the same time, I think it's perfectly natural that there will be some coming and going. And I think that's a challenge, but also an opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. We're really grateful. We may be submitting some more questions through your staff. And Alexandra and Carrie, thanks for agreeing to stay. Thanks again for making time from the National Press Foundation. We're very grateful.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and congrats to Should Have Opened with congrats to all of you on the fellowship, and best wishes to you. We'll see you out there.
Thank you.